Augustine, and I'm the president of the institute here in WA. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you to the Center for Muslim Studies and Societies, led by Professor Samina Yasmin, who can't join us. I think she's in the air as we speak, here at the UWA, for their cooperation and collaboration on this event and being able to use this venue. For those who are not aware, the AIIA is a volunteer-run organization, a not-for-profit, and the first organization of its type in Australia, founded over 100 years ago in the aftermath of the First World War. I'd also like to acknowledge some guests in the room today. I think we have the Consul General of Indonesia, Ibu Listiana. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I don't think we have any live members and fellows. I'm trying to look. No, but we acknowledge them in their absence, I guess. It is a privilege for AIIA WA to host Peter Greste today. Peter Greste. Professor Peter Greste is an Australian-born journalist, author, media freedom activist, and academic. Before joining academia in January 2018, he spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent, starting with the civil war in Yugoslavia, elections in South Africa as a freelance reporter in the early 90s, before joining the BBC as its Afghanistan correspondent in 1995. He went on to cover Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa for the BBC. In 2011, he won a Peabody Award for a BBC documentary on Somalia before joining Al Jazeera as its East Africa correspondent later that year. In December 2013, he was covering Egypt on a short 3-week assignment when he was arrested on terrorism charges. After a trial widely dismissed as a sham, he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Peter, we are proud to host a convicted terrorist here today. In February 2015, after 400 days behind bars, an intense international campaign, he was deported under a presidential decree. As a result of the letters he wrote from prison in the defense of freedom of the press, he won a Walkley Award in Australia in 2014, a Royal Television Society and Tribeca Disruptive Innovators Award in 2015. He has been awarded many other awards for his journalism and especially for his work defending press freedom and journalists. Peter has co-authored his family's account of their struggle to get him out of Egypt, Freeing Peter, as it was called, and written his own book on journalism and the war on terror, The First Casualty, published in 2017, and an updated version of the book titled The Correspondent was released earlier this year. And of course, the film of the same name is being launched nationally on April 17. Peter is in Perth to participate in the launch of this amazing film and has kindly accepted our invitation to talk to us today. He remains an avid advocate of media freedom and journalist safety. Our format for today will be in 2 parts. Peter and I will have a discussion for about 20 to 30 minutes, following which we will open up the discussion to the audience for our traditional Q&A for another maybe 30-40 minutes, depending on time. So please prepare some tough questions for Peter. After all, he was the one posing them not so long ago. I know some of you have bought copies of the book, and Peter has agreed to sign them. We do have a hard stop at around 1:30, as Peter has got a busy day of media and other appointments. Welcome, Peter. Please take a seat. Peter, let me start by recalling the mission of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which I think is very eloquent in its simplicity: to help Australians know, understand, and engage more in international affairs. Reflecting on your professional career, it seems that could even sum it up, at least to an extent. What you do, or what you have tried to do, except that you have not limited yourself to helping Australians, but a global audience understand about events and how they impact on our lives. But let me ask the question: why becoming a why become a foreign correspondent? What was the original motivation, and what kept you going all through those years when you were active in a very difficult field?
Thanks very much, Brendan, and thank you everyone for coming. I must admit, before we get into this, feeling a little bit intimidated by a room full of diplomats, former diplomats, experts in foreign affairs and diplomacy and so on. Usually I'm dealing with a much more less educated, less informed audience, so it is a little scary to be sitting here with you all. I've got to be honest with you, and thank you, Brendan, for that question, particularly in the way that you approached it from a fairly idealistic point of view. But I have to confess that my dirty little secret is that I became a foreign correspondent because I love the adventure. It was a license for me to indulge my curiosity and to... Peter Greste is a good friend of mine, another well-known journalist, described it as being at the hinges of history, those moments, those pivotal moments when things really change. And it is an extraordinary privilege to be there. Of course, the idea is around speaking truth to power, interpreting the world for the audiences that I was reporting for was very much at the heart of what I was doing. I believed very strongly in that. But as I said, the real reason I was doing it was because for me it was a license to indulge my curiosity and have those wonderful adventures.
And did you feel, just as a follow-up, did you feel as you went along that journey, the role to inform and engage? How did you develop into that sensibility?
Oh, that was always a part of what I was doing as a journalist. You know, as I said, don't get me wrong, it wasn't entirely self-indulgent. But so I read a book called One Crowded Hour, which is, there are a few people I think I can see a couple of heads nodding. The extraordinary biography of a guy called Neil Davis, who was one of Australia's best known, most respected journalists. He was operating in the 60s and 70s, 80s across Southeast Asia, working in Vietnam initially. He worked across Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, through some of the most turbulent period in that region's history. And Neil, the biography, apart from being an amazing book, also really detailed Neil's own passion for the stories that he was covering, his empathy for the people that he was working with and he was reporting on, his belief in journalism and the importance of accuracy and integrity of what he was doing, and that really appealed to me as well. And so I could see those kind of high principles that he was working towards, but I could also see the incredible adventures that he was having. And I thought, well, that's actually the kind of life that I would like to follow. I've always believed in the value of what I was doing. That always underpinned it. I would never have done this job if it was just for the adventure of it. There are plenty of other ways I could have had adventures and made a hell of a lot of money. Journalism, you don't go into journalism to get rich. But it was something that, and so the ethics of it were absolutely a part of it. And the thing I guess that I felt most strongly about was taking the stories of ordinary people and using those, drawing meaning and significance out of those stories and helping locate them in a much bigger historical and political context, so that our audiences could relate to the bigger stories through the narratives of those individuals.
Excellent. As you covered crisis after crisis, including some of the most dramatic in recent history, which I think has shaped, and I would argue continues to shape our lives, like the forever wars post 9/11, did you have the time or the luxury to reflect on how policy decisions were being made in faraway capitals, and on the possible long-term impact of those policies? And going back, I guess, a little bit to the first question, you know, as a foreign correspondent, you're obviously seeing the events on the ground, but from a policymaker's perspective, you in that core of foreign correspondents have a really special ability to bring to the attention of the public, and especially the policymakers of, among the protagonist states, often a long way from the conflict, how to bring attention to those big and difficult questions. And I like your example of the Vietnam War. I've read a few accounts of people like Neil Shanahan and the like, which similarly, the work they did eventually gave insight to the American public and policymakers on the error of a lot of the policies.
So I'm going to say something quite controversial next. And I think you talk about the policies. I think so many of the big foreign policy decisions are made, in fact, almost all of them are obviously made for domestic political reasons, not because they're designed to make the world a better place. I mean, even those that are ostensibly outward-looking are always taken with an eye to domestic audiences and domestic politics, and sometimes even very, very narrow internal political reasons in ways that don't always necessarily make sense to an external audience, to a wider public, but still have their own internal logic that can often only be seen when you get very close. And I often think that it's worth considering the counterfactual for some of these policies. I mean, the big one, you mentioned the forever war, the war on terror, which I think has been an absolutely catastrophic way of viewing and understanding the world. And I understand completely, and anybody who lived through 9/11 would recognize the colossal trauma of that moment, of those attacks. And we all, I think, understood and recognized the reason that George W. Bush declared the war on terror. But I've often reflected on, and I think one of the reasons I went to prison was because the war on terror unleashed the rhetoric of national security and terrorism and allowed governments the world over to leverage that rhetoric and use it to pass all sorts of pieces of national security legislation, to lock up all sorts of political opponents, using national security and terrorism as the logic that became, in many cases, almost impossible to oppose. And I've often wondered, it seemed to me that that phrase, the war on terror, had all sorts of consequences that I don't think we fully understood at the time, that continue to play out. We take that word war, it implies that the appropriate tools, if you're fighting a war on terror, are necessarily military. And I don't accept that was always the best way to fight that conflict, to deal with that conflict. If you think of how things might have been different, and again, I fully understand the political imperative behind George W. Bush's decision to declare the war on terror, but if he'd declared that 9/11 was a crime of mass murder, then all of a sudden we wouldn't have elevated the people that perpetrated those crimes to the status of martyrs, of heroes, some sort of great clash of civilizations. They would have been dealt with by the tools of law and order. You could still have used military support to go after those individuals, but it would have changed our entire thinking, the world's entire thinking of the relationship between the West and Islamic extremism. It would have changed things enormously. It would have contained the way in which it wouldn't have created this sort of forever war, to borrow your term, in a way that I think continues to destabilize the world and disrupt a lot of relations. Now, having said that, I completely recognize, as I said, the politics of the moment, and I know it would have taken an incredibly courageous politician to describe 9/11 as an act of mass murder rather than an act of war. But if you kind of play out that thought experiment and see the consequences of a different way of approaching it, then it becomes clear just how damaging, I think, that war on terror has actually been on the way that the world operates today.
And I remember this, not quite a journalist, but an academic friend of mine in 2001, in the lead up to the invasion of Afghanistan, submitted an op-ed piece, and he's a historian by background, talking about the failures of various great powers in Afghanistan, and the prior states to Afghanistan of being able to control that territory. And I helped him try and place that article because it was, in the public service. And I remember all the newspapers in Australia didn't want to take it on. And, in sort of pithy 800 words, if you look back in hindsight, he described what would happen. And I guess that's the role of people like yourselves in trying to give a different view of the group think, as we saw in the new cons and whatnot, and how do you manage that role, that responsibility?
It is by the war on terror creates the rhetoric tended to flatten out the world into sort of Western heroes and brown-skinned Muslims as bad guys in this conflict. And it's really interesting. I think one of the things, just as a sort of aside in a way, to give a bit of a plug to the movie, one of the things I was really pleased about with the movie was the way it disrupted those kinds of tropes. The relationships between myself and a lot of the prison, even the prison guards, prison wardens, are really complicated. These are real people who are as much victims or as much prisoners of the system as we were. And I think as a journalist, that was always the way that I saw my role. It was a way to humanize the people that we were working with, to help our audiences recognize and understand the consequences at a much more pragmatic, intimate, personal level, rather than see it as big, large, sort of faceless political players who were operating in a way that didn't really have tangible human consequences that we could understand. Does that make sense? Absolutely. I saw one of the other things, just on this, I think, and this is something I feel very strongly about also in the way that I covered Africa, and it's very true too of Afghanistan, that what we tended to use the kind of large-scale rhetoric of conflict, of ethno-nationalist conflicts in a lot of respects, of ethno-religious conflicts, and the war on terror to help us understand and make sense of a lot of these conflicts. When in fact what that becomes is I think a really cheap shorthand that doesn't actually explain anything fundamental. It's an easy descriptor, but it's not something that helps us deal with the realities of why these conflicts are taking place. A really good example I often think about is the war in Sudan, the civil war between North and South Sudan. It was always described in so much reporting and so many policy circles as a conflict essentially between black Christian Southerners and brown Arab Muslim Northerners. And if you sort of took a really quick glance at the crisis, then yes, you could see that was broadly where the conflict lines fell. But I remember meeting John Garang, who was the leader of the SPLA and the chief architect of the rebellion in the South. And John Garang, if you thought of it as an ethno-religious conflict, then the obvious solution would be to chop Sudan in two, and you'd have two sort of unified states, one Muslim Arab North and one Black Christian South. But John Garang believed in the unity of Sudan. He wanted not a separation of Sudan, he wanted political reform, because John Garang understood that it was not about ethnicity or religion. That became a convenient vector for the conflict. It was about a rebellion by the South against the hoarding of political and economic power in Khartoum. That's also why we saw the same conflict develop in Darfur. It wasn't about ethnicity. It was about the sharing, the equitable distribution of power and resources. That's a much messier conflict to understand. It doesn't sit easily with our worldview, but that's at its heart what the story was about. If our diplomats had understood that and treated it in those ways, if so many of the people that were engaged in that conflict, if so much of the journalism had genuinely reported on that, I think we'd have had a very different outcome. As it was, what happened was Sudan was chopped in two, and we ended up with not two successful states, but we ended up by doing the sorcerer's apprentice trick and chopping the problem in two, and ending up with two conflicts now, both in Sudan and South Sudan, because the fundamentals of the political system weren't changed. It remained a situation where political and economic power was hoarded by a small clique of individuals. And so we've seen further conflict because of the failure of that political system.
It's really a follow-up question. You've obviously observed some of these very bad foreign and defense policy choices by countries like ours, by Western countries in general, in response to what Harold Macmillan, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, said: "Events, dear boy, events," and how we respond to events. Why do we regularly get it wrong? Notwithstanding our great universities, our great training in history, in analysis, and we've spent since the Enlightenment trying to understand and unpack these issues, the logic of it. Why do we still get it wrong?
Because I think there is a failure of storytelling. And I think, again, if we go back to the example, I think there is a tendency. So, Australia, I've been really, really frustrated by years of Australian foreign policy because I think we've tended to, in a lot of political debates, again, flatten. Australia's become. Sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way, most diplomatic way of approaching it. Not being a seasoned diplomat.
Yeah.
The Australia I left was a very different, much more open-minded country than the one that I came back to. And I think we've become a much more fearful nation because I think a lot of governments really bought into the rhetoric of security, of the war on terror. We've othered a lot of huge parts of the world. I remember after I came back from Egypt, I went on Q&A, and I was asked a question about the war on terror. And I said, listen, there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. We are not at war with 1.3 billion people. Then to sort of prosecute the war on terror, to pretend that somehow Muslims are the hordes at the gate, is to demonize and other a whole population. Now, it's politically useful. It's domestically politically useful because it shows the governments as being strong and on security and protecting Australia, from outsiders, from hostile threats. But it is not good foreign policy. It is not good. It is not a good way of engaging with our neighbours. It really isn't. And I think it's that disconnect between the really simple narratives, which play well in 3-word slogans, stop the boats, for domestic audiences, but don't begin to touch the sides of the complexity and the reality of the problems that we're facing. Now, I'm not blaming politicians only for that. I think journalism also has a problem because, again, I found myself continually railing against a lot of cheap two-dimensional reporting from Africa on these issues. And we're seeing it more and more as the resources for good journalism continue to be degraded. And journalists are often having to parachute into stories they really don't understand and somehow become instant experts, which is impossible. And what ends up happening is that they more often than not simply amplify those existing political narratives rather than actually challenging them and forcing a much deeper, more nuanced political debate.
I think you've answered my follow-up question, but I'll maybe we can discuss it a bit more. And as a former policy analyst and contributor to policy making, at least during the time that I was part of the system, we as officials prided ourselves on being able to give free and frank advice, under the principle that having as open discussion of diverse views and policy options as possible, you you're never as open and frank as they say they want us to be, but at least it leads to better policy making, or at least by navigating the choices better. Similarly, and I think this is your point you just made, the press has traditionally played a key role in being able to provide that independent and informed view, which influences both the view of the public and policy elites. So, you've answered the question. We're not tracking that well. So maybe I'll ask for a solution statement or a brainstorming on solution. How do we make it more valuable? Because we're now in this zone where we've lost that ability, I think. And how do we regain that? Because for the benefit of better policy making, from learning from our mistakes, as we as a species hopefully still does, how do we move to that?
I'm taking the microphone with a degree of fear. I don't have an easy answer to that question. My solution is focused on the place you would expect me to focus on, and that's supporting better journalism. From a diplomat's perspective, from a policy perspective, I don't have any great insights. I do believe that one of the problems we've had is the what I regard as a catastrophic loss of foreign correspondents reporting across the world of Australia. And foreign journalism is by far and away the most expensive form of journalism. And it's also the least popular form of journalism. People tend not to engage in foreign news. But I also think it is extraordinarily important. We need journalists from Australia to interpret the world for Australians. Now, there has been a real argument, and I think there is huge validity in the argument, saying we should actually be relying on locals to report because they have the depth of insight, and that is absolutely true. But they don't necessarily have the understanding of the audiences that they're reporting for. But also, as we see, tragically, I think, in places like Gaza, nobody trusts Gazan journalists to report on what's taking place in Gaza because they happen to be Gazan. Everyone assumes, we're bought into the idea that if they're from Gaza, somehow, by definition, they must be sympathizers or even worse, collaborators or members of Hamas. And so we dismiss, it becomes possible to dismiss what those Gazan journalists are reporting. Now, I happen to know a lot of them. I happen to know how professional and dedicated they are. And so I trust a hell of a lot of what I see, almost all of what I see coming out of Gaza from those journalists. But without foreign correspondents in there reporting as independent eyes and ears, that it just doesn't carry the same sort of weight, the same sort of impetus as foreign journalists would be able to bring to those stories. I also think, as I said, the loss of money means that we're not able to have the really deep understanding of those local environments. We don't have people embedded in those places who understand the history, the context, and the deeper consequences of a lot of the events, dear boy, the events, as you say, in ways that they're able to translate. So, that alone wouldn't solve the problem you're talking about. I think also it's that other problem that I'm not an expert in. I think social media has changed things. At times, it feels as though we're not suffering from too little information. Every time you open up the phone, it feels like we're suffering from too much. But it's the quality of that information that matters, and it's the way that information is conveyed to us, context, the kind of stuff that's around that information that I think makes it very difficult for ordinary people to make sense of. And so, again, I would argue that we need to somehow tackle, and it's a whole other subject, and I have some views on it, but I'm not an expert on the way that we should be managing. So,
the Institute was founded to kind of get citizens informed so we can influence our policymakers. How do you think we're doing on that? I mean, you're an activist as well. How, as citizens, as informed citizens, do you think we can, firstly, how we're doing? I think, in terms of being able to influence foreign policy choices, to what can we be doing more with the knowledge and information we get?
Yeah, so these are questions, I get this kind of question a lot in various forms, particularly when it comes also to things like journalism. How do we support good journalism? How do we make these, how do we work better as a society? And I honestly wish I had a good answer for you, Brendan. I don't at the moment. I feel quite lame in not having a good answer. I wish I had a magic bullet that would solve this problem. Clearly, it's a wonderful turnout. It's clear that we've got groups of individuals that really do care, that are interested in this stuff. I just look at the demographic, though, that's here, and I worry a lot about the younger people. And I can see a few young faces, but I am genuinely concerned that we're not able to engage, that this is a generational problem as much as anything else, which also I think speaks to the issue of social media. The failure of social media to really explain the world in a coherent, sensible, rational way and well-informed way to the next generation. Now, I'm constantly impressed by a lot of my students that I work with at Macquarie University and University of Queensland, but I also feel as though there are very deep systemic problems that we've got to come to terms with, and ultimately I do think that the way social media, the way in which our information sphere is working, I think is becoming increasingly broken, and that's where we need to focus. I honestly don't have a quick, ready answer for that.
Another one, it's more a rhetorical question, but I like your views. You've already mentioned it. You've reflected on the really tragic situation of journalists in the Gaza war in the postscript of the updated 2025 edition of your book as a particularly poignant case study. Of significant deterioration of the freedom of the press, with even credible allegations of the press being targeted. And we see the quality of democracy around the world, so the outrage hasn't been there. Is there anything that can be done to reverse this trend? Sorry, another hard one. It's more, maybe it's a therapy session, Peter.
Yes. Yeah, you can all, once we just finish this discussion, we can solve the problem. Look, I suppose in a way one of the things in the notes that you sent me, and I'm going to jump around this because one of the things you asked was why, the question about why states fail, that book, Why States Fail.
Yeah. And
it seems to me, and the thesis in the very famous book is that successful states, the basic sort of two-line summary is that successful states work because they serve the mass, they're broad-based, they're inclusive rather than exclusive. They serve their population rather than their leaders. And I think that one of the things we're seeing, and I look to the US in particular on this, you talk about that supposedly the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, and in both of those cases, which are held up as bastions of democracy and democratic values, you see them serving the leaders, not the people. And I think there is a danger in drifting in that direction in a way that I think is unraveling democracy. And it's not always easy to see. I've had the real privilege of spending 5 years in Latin America and across another 12 years in Africa. And seeing the way in which a lot of Latin American countries moved from autocracy, from dictatorship to really stable, prospering democratic governments. And it has been that inversion of political and economic power where those populations in places like Chile, for example, have, and to a lesser extent Argentina, but Chile is, I think, a really good example of a country that went through a really nasty dictatorship and saw and understood the way in which it had been government, economic and political power had been concentrated in a military clique for their own interests. And they've managed to invert that. Now, they're not out of the woods, but I think that shows that it's possible to reverse those trends. And if we can see that, if we can see the way that it's worked in those places, we can perhaps spot those trends now and hopefully start to push back. Now, again, this is a really difficult discussion. I'm not suggesting that that narrative is an easy sell or that it changes things, but that's what I start to see, and that's where I think we may get into a really difficult place.
You've really touched on one of my really nerdy interests, which, you know, I too lived in Africa, as we were discussing earlier. And the book that Peter was referring to is by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail, and both of them and another person associated with that sort of research won the Nobel last year for economics, and it was a great validation of my reading choices.
And did I describe it reasonably?
Yeah, but the specific question is, and relating to what you just said about Latin America, one thing, I haven't spent time in Latin America, just visits, but Southeast Asia and Africa, and it's always like, my mind is always going, why some of those lessons, and I can add Latin America there, of delivering more democracy, and through democracy, better economic outcomes, better human development index outcomes. Why hasn't Africa been able to do that? You know, I've got my theories. I'd like to listen to yours.
So I think there's a kind of higher level theological, philosophical reason for it, and I think, and again, it goes back to the thesis I was making earlier about the way in which we tend to confuse ideological struggles and really difficult pragmatic political struggles. I think the failure, for example, one of the reasons we're seeing the spread of Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism is because that fills the space that's left by governments. If you look in Somalia, if you look across the Maghreb, places like northern Nigeria, it's the absence of state, it's the absence of governance, the absence of government support and government institutions that allows those institutions, that allows Islamic extremism to flourish. But that means that those governments have to take responsibility for that failure. It's much easier to sort of dismiss it as terrorism and blame it all on Islamists without taking any responsibility for governments. The other thing is that I think there's been a catastrophic failure of aid and aid policy because it's disrupted the relationship between governments and the public that they're supposed to be serving. And I think of the way that aid tends to be delivered is in a way that people that are delivering the aid like to take ownership of. And that means sticking on the side of a school, generous gift of USAID, for example. That doesn't help. I remember so many times in places, I remember a conversation having with the Congo with a lady who was complaining about the lack of education and healthcare for her kids. She was saying, where is UNESCO? Where is the WFP? Where are those aid agencies? Not, where is my government? And when those agencies step in, those agencies are accountable not to the people that they're supposed to be delivering aid to, but to their communities back at home, to their donors. But those donors are accountable in turn to their own political constituencies, not to the people that the aid is supposed to be serving. And so what happens, I think, is that aid tends to become disruptive, and you end up with states, with governments that don't actually have to fulfill that responsibility of serving the people that elect and break that kind of social contract between votes for services. That's a kind of detailed sort of discussion about why aid fails, maybe not at the question that you're asking, but I think that's been a big part of the problem that we've had.
Great. Final question before I go to audience Q&A. A few years ago, and some of you were there, I think, here at the Institute, we launched, I think he's a friend of yours, Ian Camish's book, The Consul, which delves into the world of how the Australian government supports consular cases, which of course, you were one of the most high profile ever. How do you view that, the support you received, and, have you got cause to think of, how do we do it compared to other countries?
So I'm going to issue an apology here. In the movie, hands up, there are a few people I know who are going to see the movie this evening. Well, that's quite lovely. Okay. The Australian consular officials don't come out of it particularly well. That's partly because, that's one of the things that I'm a little bit frustrated with in the movie. It portrays my initial meeting with DFAT consular officials fairly accurately, because the DFAT is, again, you'll understand this, I'm sure most of you will understand this far better than I do. There are very strict rules around what DFAT consular staff can say and the help that they can offer people who are in that position. And there is a judicial process that has to be gone through, that the detainee has to pass through. And so initially it was very, very frustrating for me, because I knew the crisis that we were facing. But as time went on, I think DFAT did become far more engaged and did give a tremendous amount of help and support. Now, I want to thank the consular staff for their role in that, but I also believe that one of the main reasons that happened was because there was a political campaign, a very prominent public campaign, that gave DFAT the political space that they needed to step outside the boundaries of what they would normally do and the way that they would normally engage with this story in similar cases. And the problem, there was an inquiry last year into Australia's handling of arbitrary detentions. And I and Kylie Moore-Gilbert, Kylie in fact is the real driver of that campaign, and she was the one that I think managed to get that Senate inquiry up. She and I and Sean Turnell, who is another, who all feel that DFAT's default position to not speak about these issues or to handle is to go towards quiet diplomacy first and foremost, I think is problematic. I think it is, the advice to families is to just not speak out because you'll complicate discussions. My family came to the conclusion that the Egyptians were perfectly capable of making the distinction between the noisy rabble that was often on social media and sometimes emotional responses of my family from the more nuanced and considered discussions that were taking place between consular and diplomatic staff and their own officials. I remember very clearly, after I was released from Egypt, I went to Europe on a lobbying tour because both my colleagues were still in prison. They were still facing terrorism, a retrial, a second trial, as I was. And so I needed to campaign to get them out as well. And I spoke to a European diplomat and I said, listen, what can we do? How do we help the pressure on the Egyptian authorities? And he said, keep going with Twitter and Facebook. Keep going with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Keep speaking publicly about it. And I said, but the Egyptians don't give a shit about Facebook and Twitter. And every time Human Rights Watch speaks, it just winds the Egyptians up. And he said, you're right, that they don't, but I care. And because I care, it means that I can go into it gives me the capacity to go into my meetings with my Egyptian counterparts and say that we can't get on with normal business until you resolve this because I'm under pressure. And so I sometimes think the value of of that political pressure in keeping up, in keeping these cases at the top of mind, of making them key issues in consular discussions and diplomatic discussions, saying, listen, we need to deal with this because of the pressure, the public pressure that that we're under. Now, I know that might not always be great news for diplomats that are trying to negotiate other agreements. But your question was about how we deal with these kinds of cases. And as a detainee, as a former detainee myself, I can absolutely see the value or the impact of that public pressure on the diplomacy that took place in my case.
Absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I've been trying to get Sean Turnell here, who's a good old friend, but you beat him to it. You got here first.
Sean is a professor at Macquarie University, as am I, and Kylie has just taken on a job as an academic job at Macquarie. So we've got our own little cell of terrorists and spies.
Fantastic. All right. I'll go hands up first. I think I saw first three right there. So I'm going to stand there and let three of you ask the question, and then maybe you can handle it in a group, so it'll be easier with the mic. Maybe introduce yourself. What's your question?
James Dudley, Murdoch University retired. You alluded to it a little. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been really terrific, so thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to it. You've alluded to it about issues of social media. I'd be interested to know what you see as the role and future of serious/traditional journalism in a world where I think sometimes 30% of people get all of their news from social media. I mean, traditional media, serious media, does it still have a role? And if so, how can we ensure it's more effective?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Cristiano Granata. I'm the British Consul General here in Perth. I've been a diplomat for 28 years, but also a journalist for 7 years and a diplomatic for the same time. And I share your plan. Thank you so much. Louder. Okay. My name is Cristiano Granata. I'm the Indonesian Consul General here in Perth. I've been a diplomat for 28 years, but also a journalist for 7 years in Jakarta for same time. And I share the feeling about social media, how it's disrupting the way we communicate. But as a policymaker, as part of the government, as once a journalist before, it's sort of like you're damned if you don't use it, and you have to use it. You're damned using it, then you're not using it. We don't know how to go about social media. We need that. Our ministry is really pushing into using social media to share our story, especially with the younger generation, to get them interested in the foreign policy. But then you're right, doesn't have the right platform to share what we do, and it's very complicated, it's very complex, and we can't really share. So my question is very easy. Do you have an instant recipe on how we can actually talk to you as a foreign journalist, a foreign correspondent, and use the social media to share our work? Thank you.
And that regions? Oh, we're doing.
Yeah, the street event, and then
I'll be going to the queue then. Is this working?
yeah.
Thanks for talking to us, Peter. I saw your movie last week, and I just have a couple of questions about it. So, the actor that portrayed Richard, he did a few speeches for the news, Al Jazeera. They were quite detailed, but quite even-handed, I thought. And yet, for some reason, you were singled out. And I was just wondering if it was one particular thing you said, or lost in translation, or something like that. The other question I have is that the prison guards, the people that came in contact with you, they actually treated you seemingly quite well. And how close is that to reality? There might have just been a few modifications or whatever, but I did wonder about that.
Okay.
I was expecting something like a Midnight Express or whatever. Okay.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I'll take those. I'll come back to the question about the movie in a moment, but I'll take those two questions together because I think they are very closely related. I think so. My solution, my one hit, my magic bullet, is not an easy one to fire. It's politically very, very difficult. But my argument is that the question you posed. So what was your name? The Indonesian.
Listian.
Listian. Listian, the question that you posed was how do we use social media? I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think we need to be asking how we get social media to work for us. Because we assume, and this is really the responsibility of governments, and it's incredibly difficult nettle to grasp, and I'm not suggesting, this is why I think it's a very, very difficult bullet to fire. But we've come to treat social media platforms and the algorithms as a kind of evolutionary given, as if they're beyond our control. But it's a bit, I think of it a bit like automobiles. You know, the car makers said it was impossible to change the way that they built cars because consumers didn't want it. It would make them too expensive. But in the end, government said, no, you have to build in emissions controls and collapsible steering columns and seat belts and airbags and all sorts of things. And so we made those cars useful for us and safe for us to use. We don't do that with social media, with the algorithms. The algorithms are designed to monetize our attention for the profit of the companies in Palo Alto or in Beijing or wherever they're located. And frankly, that doesn't help good conversation. It doesn't privilege accurate information. It privileges polemic and outrage. It's angertainment. That's not good for policy debate. It's not good for public discussion. It's not good for social cohesion. It's not good for good journalism. It doesn't elevate good journalism. It marginalizes the really sober stuff and amplifies the outrageous journalism. And as a journalist, I know how that's shifting the way in which journalists are having to approach their work. That's not the fault of journalists. It's the fault of the algorithms, which monetize that and elevate that kind of content. And as journalists, you now have to depend on eyeballs to make those things, to make money work, or to make your money, to keep alive. And so at some point, I think we're going to have to get to the stage where we are legislating around the way that algorithms work. And I've spoken to a couple of former Facebook officials, Frances Haugen in particular, who is the Facebook whistleblower, and I asked her whether it's possible to create an algorithm that draws people into the centre rather than off into the extremes, that privileges good journalism and elevates good journalism and helps direct money towards good journalism. And she said, of course it is. If we can engineer in one direction, we can also engineer in the other. I think we need to be doing that. But that, as I said, I know is a very, very difficult thing to grasp. Now, to the question about the movie. You asked about both the prison guards, and you asked on the reporting. Okay, that's right. You asked about the reporting. What was it that we did that put us in prison?
Well, just what was it that made them single you out? Because it seems to me even-handed.
And
Yet
the reporting, and in fact, I'm really, really gratified that you described those speeches from Richard Roxburgh. They were speeches. The speeches, what you call a speech, was some of the scripting, the reporting that Richard was doing. That reporting was lifted straight from my scripts.
Yeah, I assumed it would.
They were verbatim scripts of mine, and so yeah, I'm glad you used that word even-handed. It had nothing to do with our reporting. So I really struggled with exactly that question. What was it that we had done that had upset the Egyptians? Until I realised that it wasn't about anything that we had done. It was about what we'd come to represent. I'd only been in Egypt for a couple of weeks. The Egyptians made a created a big narrative around Qatari malfeasance in Egypt. Al Jazeera, of course, is owned by the Qataris, and they'd accused Qatar of supporting and sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood. They'd also accused the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terrorism.
That was the timing thing.
Well, it was partly a timing factor, but it was also this sort of, there was a conspiracy theory that they had in mind. Now, if the Egyptians were serious about making that conspiracy theory work, then I was the last person that you would come after, because there were plenty of other Al Jazeera journalists who had much deeper connections. And so I realized, in fact, it wasn't genuinely about that conspiracy. It was that the Egyptians wanted to send a message to all journalists that you will not speak to the opposition, you will only follow the official narrative. They came after us because we were politically convenient, because they were able to apply that kind of overall narrative of Qatari malfeasance, but it really wasn't about that. They weren't interested in trying to build that case. They just wanted to scare the crap out of journalists. The other question that you asked is around the guards. And again, I'm glad that you raised that.
It seemed to maltreat you really.
And anyone who's read
Spoiler alert.
anyone who's read my book would also recognize there was, so the answer is absolutely, that was exactly the way things were. It really was. It was not Midnight Express. And then I was very, very concerned that the filmmakers would create a kind of a Midnight Express version of what we went through, that they'd flatten out all of the brown-skinned Muslim guys into these evil villains, these kind of nasty, abusive characters. They weren't. As I said, they were as much prisoners of the system as we were. There was a tremendous amount of humanity that was shown across the board. Now, not all of them, some of the guards were complete assholes, but for the most part, they were just there to do their job. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want to fight. They didn't want to cause problems. There was a real understanding. I remember the warden at one point said to me, he said, because he asked me, why were we supporting the Brotherhood? And I said, listen, you have access to all of the evidence that was presented in court. Go through that evidence, and if you could find anything to justify the allegations against us, I said, I'll happily spend the next 7 years of my life in your prison. And a week later, he came back to me and he said, Mr. Peter, it's all just politics. and we weren't physically abused. I mean, I know of people who were, but they didn't see us as terrorists, as a threat. They understood that it was political. So, yeah, it was a much more complicated set of relationships that we developed with the guards. And I was very, very concerned that come out in the movie. And I actually think that's one of the strengths of the movie.
I'll take one question. There are two questions then. I'll come back to you.
Are just as important as other ones. How behind the scenes, what are those challenges and how might they be overcome?
Krishna Sen, an international Perth centre. As you know, Peter, we are particularly interested in riders in prison and terrorists like you and Tyler Gilbert. So there is a blogger currently in a Chinese prison. His name is Yang Hengjun, and this is kind of follows on. It's a bit of a footnote to the previous question about China. And we are running a couple of weeks of campaign around him partly because he is under a suspended death sentence, and his trial was a secret trial, it was a perjury trial, and he had seemed to have completely disappeared from our political map. Now, listening to you, it occurred to me that maybe just as there is a kind of hierarchy of nations in this terrorist versus those of us who are good people and those of us who are in the middle, perhaps there is a hierarchy of Australians and Australian political prisoners elsewhere. And the situation with Young is because he's not white as Australian as some other Australians, because he didn't he wasn't born in this country, he looks different, and he's sort of Chinese. And so we kind of tend to forget about him, and we are not getting any impact with that campaign either.
I'll come back in the next round. You remember who put up their hands off. But put it up again if I'm not coming up here.
Okay, let's very quickly deal with the China question. Chris, one of the reasons I've recognised, I've often spoken about this, one of the reasons I'm here and not still in prison in Egypt is just because I had the dumb luck to be called Peter and not Muhammad. That always strikes me as I mean, obviously I'm here and I'm grateful for everything that got me out, but I also have to acknowledge that that was a big part of it. That if I was brown-skinned and Islamic, then I'd be in real trouble. And there are plenty of other people around the world who are brown-skinned, who are Chinese, Australians, who are stuck in those sorts of circumstances, who just don't get anywhere near the traction because of their name and their ethnicity, the colour of their skin. And I don't have, I know it's tragic, it's fundamentally wrong, it really makes me angry. And I wish there was a way of saying that, you know, we just need to make these stories more human. But you know, the problem is that humans identify with people who look like them. And that's one of the reasons why my case got so much more traction than his case. It really frustrates.
More things.
Sorry?
You were also more famous.
Well, yeah, and there were a lot of things that were dumb luck. I mean, I was more famous. I had a lot more relationships with other journalists around the world. I worked for the BBC, so the BBC got involved with this. I worked across Africa, and so I had a lot of connections with other news organisations. I had a reputation with politicians and diplomats. You know, I mean, for all sorts of reasons that were just dumb luck. My case was elevated in ways that would never otherwise have been the case. And also, to be fair, my family also got engaged in a way, and I think, hands up here remembers my mum and dad. Yeah, yes, you all remember my mum and dad. That's not the case. I mean, Kylie's own family, it's one of Kylie's frustrations, was that her family refused to speak publicly. I was trying to reach out to them, but they took, no disrespect to DFAT, but they took DFAT's advice and they did not, because they were terrified of saying the wrong thing, which meant that she never had a public advocate like my mum and dad. My mum and dad became so powerful and they created that political momentum. So, you know, at a personal level, I think it's one of the reasons why we need to see families getting involved and being prepared to speak out. Doesn't always work. Some families aren't quite as articulate as my parents were, but that's the lesson. That's one of the big lessons that I took. Your question about China, I think also is one of the problems. You talk about how do we have those nuanced conversations. I'm going to throw the blame onto China themselves, because I mean, we needed Bill Birtles there. We needed China correspondents there. Imprisoning Chen Lei made it, and arresting Bill and his other colleague, what was his name? It was Bill, and there were two of them, Sydney Morning Herald, the Financial Times correspondent. They made it impossible for Western journalists to work in China. And I know Bill is a really good journalist. He sees the world in a way that I did. He wanted to help make sense of China, to really get under the skin of China, to help us really appreciate the kind of nuances and complexities of Chinese politics and Chinese society, and help us appreciate the Chinese worldview. It doesn't necessarily mean we had to accept it, but we have to understand it. And I think the loss of correspondence, of foreign correspondence in China is a tragedy. Now, I don't know how we solve that problem unless China is willing to open up and accept foreign journalists, more foreign journalists. There are still a small handful, but most of them have left. And I think that's a very serious problem. Your question, very quickly. Sorry, remind me.
The forgotten wars of it.
Yeah, trendy conflict. Yeah. So I've been working on trying to develop a documentary on Myanmar, which is counts, I think, as one of those unsexy, disappeared conflicts. And it's become, I know how difficult it is to raise money to produce a documentary on a crisis that I think actually, frankly, is far more relevant to Australia and have far more serious consequences for Australia than anything we're seeing in Gaza, the Middle East, or Northern Europe. That will produce, it's already produced a huge increase in the amount of narcotics, in the amount of, in a wave of cybercrime, in human trafficking and drugs and weapons smuggling. All of those things are spilling out of Myanmar into our region. I think will have some very serious consequences for us and destabilise the region. But it's really hard. Again, I don't have an easy answer for that because, those other conflicts are far more at the top of mind. My only argument is to go back to the one that I've been making time and again in our conversation, and that's to support journalism. Because even if we don't all consume it, that doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact. Simply having this stuff on the record helps it seep into our consciousness, and that's a hard argument to make when journalism has to pay for itself. But that's also why I'm making this argument, figuring out different ways of financing journalism, recognising it as a public good, and financing it in a way from public resources. Controversial, unsexy, unlikely to get all that, but that's what I believe has to happen.
And just a quick reflection on my part, when I was living in Africa, the Darfur conflict, I mean, that got a microscope shone on it when people like George Clooney started. Yeah, so
was another.
And so, not an answer, but the trick that I've seen in the past is, you get celebrities to adopt the conflict, and suddenly it gets, the thought of the day, so to speak. Unfortunately, a bit that's how the world works. I've got this gentleman, and then up there. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm Laurie Balian from the medical school at UWA, so totally undiplomatic. But I would like, first of all, to congratulate you on surviving your adventures, particularly your latest adventure in Egypt, and surviving it with integrity. And my question is relation to integrity of journalists. This is obviously something that we're all concerned about and which we expect. But when we look at some of the popular presses around the world, perhaps particularly in America and to some extent in Australia, the popular press and the journalists writing for it seem to be driven by the politics of their owners, and to an extreme extent where they will, for example, in America, deny that the election wasn't a fair one, the last election, even though they knew that was false. So perhaps you could comment on how we're going to retain and develop journalists with integrity in our traditional means of press.
Peter, thank you very much. Julian Stern, former lawyer, UWA student and lawyer. I have family in the defence, and I would like to hear your answers as to how can we have immediate transparency between defence, government, AIIA, DFAT, foreign correspondence, and report to public accurately well before dramatic, unreal, scaremongering journalists get hold and throw it out to news channels, and even have our politicians and prime ministers not knowing what's going on in the immediate. For example, our Chinese Navy circumventing Australian mapping subsea, planes throwing flares over our RAF Poseidon planes up near the South China Seas from Japan, and also the planes that were down near Sydney. How can that be somehow circumnavigated and thrown to the public in the most accurate way?
So Oscar, former student, don't have the same qualifications as everyone else yet. My question is also around journalistic practice, and particularly this pressure of journalists to be balanced, like you said. I'm wondering how we can do that moving forward in issues that aren't balanced. I'm thinking climate change, you've got one side that it's happening, one side that it's not, and they are objectively wrong. But it's not just something as simple as that. It's like fascism's on the rise, really extremist ideologies. It becomes very difficult to give both sides a voice when I would say most reasonable and ethical people would say that there is actually a correct side and an incorrect side. How do you navigate that without creating these false equivalencies?
Oscar, Bruce,
Yes.
yeah, I feel very proud that somebody who went to school with my daughters has come to my event.
Thanks, Brent. So all of these questions are interconnected, and there really is one relatively straightforward answer to this. So you asked the question about bias in journalism. You're asking a question about balance and sort of false equivalence. And your question about the sort of courageous reporting of some of the... there was a nuance to your question. I'm just going to very quickly deal with it. I think part of the problem is the relationship between, as you said, between media and our security intelligence agencies. And I've worked with a lot of security intelligence agencies, and I have never come across any institution that is as secretive as Australian security and defence organisations. There is a culture of secrecy in this country which I think is deeply toxic. I've worked with militaries all over the world, and it is by far and away the hardest one to work with is the ADF and ASIO and ACES and all of the agencies beginning with A. It's a really, and I think it is very, very corrosive because it doesn't support really good reporting on our security and intelligence agencies. It doesn't really support good debate. A lot of stuff gets suppressed that should be in the public domain, and that's a real problem, and I've been arguing for that. And we've been trying to work on ways of trying to break down the kind of barriers and allow more open communication. To sort of deal with the other questions more broadly, the simple answer is, again, the one that I've been talking about earlier, and that is the way that the business models have been broken and the way the algorithms actually operate, right? You spoke about biased reporting, and you spoke about the way some journalists are publishing views that support their proprietors. I think the problem is partly due to the journalists themselves, partly because it's very difficult to make the distinction between journalism that's produced ethically and stuff that is not, the noise that's out there online, social media. But a big part of it is because the digital environment privileges news organisations that create tribes. Fox News is a classic example. They've created a right-wing tribe and they throw red meat to that tribe. You mentioned the denial of the election result, the 2020 election result, as a prime example. Journalists don't, and obviously that I'm making sweeping statements, not all journalists are ethical journalists, but the vast majority that I know do not ever want to do that kind of work, but they have to, because they need to survive, they need to pay, they need to do it to keep alive. I remember, just as by way of example, let me give you a sort of half-true example in a thought experiment. You're an editor of a newspaper, and you've lost all of your advertising, traditional advertising revenue, you're trying to pay the bills, and you've got a choice. You can send your journalists out to spend 2 weeks investigating the procurement policies of maybe Perth, the city council here, to investigate, and because you know that there's possibly, you're getting rumours of corruption, you can do that story, you'll spend weeks and probably thousands and thousands of dollars doing it. You know that a small proportion of the public will watch it, will see it. It's politically important. It's important reporting. It will probably make a difference. Or you can send them down to the port, as I saw when I was in Sydney, to jump on Tinder to see the kind of messages that the American sailors from the latest ship are using to hook up with Aussie girls. Now, I know which of those two stories is going to generate the most clicks, right? I know because I actually rather sleazily, cheaply, I felt really dirty afterwards. I clicked on that headline when I saw it in Brisbane, in Sydney. The moment I did, I sort of thought, oh God, no, why did I do that? But the fact is that the algorithms, the business environment privileges that kind of reporting. It does not support the really deep investigations. Hands up those of you who saw Adele Ferguson's reporting into the banks. Okay, this is a very privileged audience, and there are a lot of your hands went up, but there are a lot of hands that didn't. If I asked that question at a normal audience of ordinary members of the public, maybe 4 or 5% of the hands in the audience go up. But that reporting, and I promise you, that reporting, Adele Ferguson, in her reporting on the banking system, she spent literally years on that work, that story, and it would have cost the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. The revenue that story generated would nowhere near have covered the cost of producing it. But her story triggered a Royal Commission that triggered reforms that benefited every Australian with a bank account. Now, how do we reconcile that in a world where the journalism itself has to pay either through subscriptions or through clicks? And in a world that where the revenues of news organisation is driven by subscriptions or clicks, that world privileges speed over accuracy, polemic over sober analysis, rumour over serious reporting. That's not the fault of the journalists. I'm not suggesting that all journalism is good or has integrity, but it's the way the system drives the journalism. So somewhere along the line, we've got to reconsider how we finance it so that we get the journalism that supports us, not supports the algorithms, right? And that also, I think, cuts to the question to your question about this kind of false equivalence. There is a tendency for false equivalence, and this is again about the integrity of good journalism. It's an issue that journalists and news organisations have wrestled with, and the issue around climate change, I think, is now settled. Very few news organisations, and there have been quite a few initially controversial, now not so controversial edicts from major news organisations who are saying that we cannot accept, you have someone who is talking about the impact of climate change, you then have to bring on a climate change denier for the sake of balance. That's not good reporting. But it takes a lot of political pressure off you when you've got political parties that are trying to deny climate change, for example. I don't really, it's been a constant debate throughout journalism. How do you do that? I remember, just to pluck an example that I remember very vividly, was when we went off to report. I was in Yugoslavia for a period. We reported, I remember, some mass graves that were very clearly Bosnians, and the Serbs said, no, we had nothing to do with it. I mean, it was just blindingly obvious that they were responsible for it. But as a journalist, you're sort of duty-bound to present all of the evidence and then go and publish the denial, which gives the denial a degree of credibility that it wouldn't otherwise have had. But you kind of have to put it in there because you have to go and speak to the alleged perpetrators to get their response. It's a very, very difficult line to walk.
I think, unfortunately, we have arrived at time. You have heard from Peter. Please buy the book and watch the movie. In the next 24 hours or so, you will get an email with a special offer and a code, promo code to get the book at 20% discount, and you can buy it online. And before we finish off, can I please, however, invite AIIA WA committee member Robin McLennan to offer the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, and Peter, thank you. I have to admit, and this isn't news to some of you, but I've been pretty close to depression for the last few months. You can hear my accent and guess why. And when I saw that you were speaking for us, I thought, how can we come to this and go home and be optimistic? I mean, this is a terrible story what this gentleman went through and suffered on our behalf, let's face it. And how is he going to make this into some kind of good news story? And I sat back there and I looked at you and I thought, my gosh, he's got to be optimistic because he's teaching at a university, thinking that those young people are going to have a world in which they can make a difference. And even better, he works for a university that has a department that hires not one, not two, but 3 people like him. So that's also great news. And I think we also have great news in that we have great institutions here in Western Australia, and people like us need to keep sending the message that we expect those institutions to continue funding parts of their universities that talk about issues like we're talking about today. So kind of, if I could have raised my hand, you don't have to ask for those questions because we used up the time, but my first question was going to be, what do you do in 400 days of prison? And my second one is, how'd you get so smart? Maybe those two are related. Honestly, it was a huge tour de force. I really appreciated your insights. And, you know, as Brendan said, we kind of worked around these issues. And gosh, I think my last title should have been, instead of Senior Counterterrorism Advisor, wouldn't Senior Counter-Mouse Murderer Advisor been much better? Why didn't I think of that? So you really gave me lots of things that I'd never reflected on, and I really appreciate it. So thanks to you, and we have a little present for you, which is wrapped up so well, I don't even know what it is, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I'd also like to say thanks to all of you for coming. And if you're wondering what you can do, Brendan already told you, you can join AIIA if you're not already a member. You can keep coming to our events, spread the word to your friends. These things only have an impact if we all engage. So please talk to your friends, talk about what you heard today, try to get some engagement going. As Brandon said, go buy the book, go see the movie. And most of all, we hope to see you at another AII event soon.